Screams of pain from a student at the Judge Rodenberg Center as he's tied down and shocked for hours.
Full-grown young men crammed into cribs. A shower room where groups of adults are hosed down. Stick-thin children left alone, some with bodies contorted and atrophied from years of neglect. This little boy was tied to his crib early one morning and was still tied up later that afternoon. Some boys and girls in these conditions simply stop growing.
This is a 21-year-old boy who's never been let out of the crib.
His body seems frozen. One human rights organization calls it inhumane and torture.
Rarely do we ever hear these stories of torture and neglect in mental asylums in America. But there was a point where mental patients had no rights and were treated with cruel and unusual punishments. Movies and shows are now inspired by past stories of such acts that have sparked interest and research of this dark past. Mental patients weren't treated with the rights they have today. They didn't have institutions established specifically for them, so they shared cells with other mental patients and were often thrown in basements. Mental patients were considered satanic and cursed by God because of the religious beliefs of the doctors and nurses in charge of the establishments. Their safety was almost never guaranteed and didn't matter to anyone due to the fact that doctors thought the mentally ill were beneath. Eventually, people like Dorothy Dix and the Boston Prison Discipline Society in 1825 came around. They helped spark a movement for mental patients' rights and helped establish the first mental institutions to care for the mentally ill. One of the first institutions to ever be built was the Eastern State Hospital in Williamsburg, Virginia, opened on October 12, 1773, which is still operational to this day. This didn't change the way the patients were tortured, though. Patients were still treated as if they had no rights. Doctors believed they had to be cured with harsh treatments and insulin coma therapies and lobotomies. The hospitals were there for them to be comfortable, but then turned into Gothic-style prisons, which meant torture. The patients were tortured in the most gruesome ways you could think of. Doctors used the electroshock therapy just to keep their patients in line. Some patients would even undergo lobotomy, which is an operation in which the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain are severed. These were all of the harsh and unusual punishments the patients received in these new institutions that were made in order to treat their disabilities. This unfair treatment caused scientists and researchers to develop new medicine and treatments to not further damage these patients, but to rehabilitate them. In the years of 1950, new drugs were introduced to help these patients instead of harming them. According to William Gronfine, in 1955, their state mental institutions in the U.S. housed almost 500,000 patients at the time, and they were all getting a better treatment. As the years went by, treatment and institutions got better and were more efficient to mental patients. In the year 1963, President Kennedy even committed to the mental patients' rights movement by signing the Community Health Act of 1963, which this provided $150 million to new mental health facilities and improved existing mental health centers.
Under this legislation, custodial mental institutions will be replaced by therapeutic centers. It should be possible within a decade or two to reduce the number of patients in mental institutions by 50% or more. It was said at an earlier age that the mind of man is a far country which can be neither approached nor explored. But today, under present conditions of scientific achievement, it will be possible to make the remote reaches of the mind accessible. The mentally ill need no longer be alien to our affections or beyond the help of our communities.
His commitment to making mental institutions a better environment for mental patients was a big leap from past mental hardships. This is seen by the big drop of population in mental institutes by 1977, which reduces to 160,000 patients. It all seemed great for the mentally ill to have its rights protected until the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan had to make budget cuts to several social programs, thus affecting services for the mentally ill. It negatively affected these patients because they were no longer receiving the proper treatments once again, and their institutions were suffering. Reagan also repealed the earlier instated 1980 Mental Health Systems Act, which gave grants to increase their services given to the mentally ill and the treatments as well.
Were turned loose from institutions who did have mental problems, whether it was retardation or whatever, and there was no place for them at the local level, and in many instances either no family or no family that wanted them, and there they are in the streets, and they present a problem also in the sense that in many instances, having walked away from an institution, they turn away from many efforts at help because they feel that it might get them back institutionalized. Now, I don't know what percentage of all of the people that are out there fall into that particular situation, but I do know that, from my experience as governor, that we tried at the state level to subsidize local treatment centers where they could live at home and be, with the development now of newer drugs and so forth, drugs in the good sense, that they could be outpatients. And this was coming along, although in some instances counties, just even with the state subsidy, would not take this up. But this is a problem in which, unless they represent a threat to someone else, we're helpless to put them in an institution where they would receive the best of care and certainly have fine quarters and be fed and all.
Let me share with you a letter I received today from a family that does have someone in the family who is mentally ill, and what they say about it. They say first they suffered through emptying and closing of hospitals. They say then the dumping of their relatives onto the streets. Then they had the withdrawal of funds for community-based programs, they say. They say in Illinois, because of a withdrawal of $18 million, Governor Thompson has cut from mental health programs. They're now faced with the stoppage of research. What would you tell these people?
Then the 1999 Olmstead ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court gave the mentally ill a chance to have appropriate care in a community setting, making their recovery faster and more beneficial. Some states violated the Supreme Court's Olmstead decision, but once Obama took charge, he reinforced it, and also added the Americans with Disabilities Act and amendments to protect the rights for mental patients, and to also loosen the definition of a disability to let these people have the equal rights and fair treatment the government is responsible for.
5 Americans is living with a disability. Over 50 million people, including many of our friends and neighbors, teachers and co-workers, heroes and leaders. 20 years ago, the Americans with Disabilities Act guaranteed every person the right to live, work, and participate fully in the American experience. We've come a long way since then, and we are committed to making even more progress in the years ahead. Visit disability.gov to see how you can help.